I'm a statistician, and I'm going to argue that so are you, and you, and you. In fact, all of us as human beings are statisticians. Every day, our senses are being bombarded by input from eyes, skin, ears, and all of that input or data is what we use to evaluate risks, make decisions, and live our lives. If I'm going to cross the street, I use my eyes. I see a bus over there. It's stopped because it's picking up passengers, so I don't need to worry about that. Over there, I see a yellow car. It's speeding, but it's speeding away from me, so I don't need to worry about that. But I can see a person on a bicycle over there, and he's slightly wobbly, and he's coming toward me, but it's not going that quickly. So if I cross the street now, I can manage to get across and will survive. That's a risk evaluation. Or if I'm playing football, I've managed to outsmart two opponents. I'm 20 meters away from the goal, but the goalie is looking pretty sharp. Do I take the shot? Yes or no? I make an evaluation, and either I shoot or I wait a bit. So throughout our lives, we are using statistical evaluations in order to make our decisions, and they're all based on internal models or our experience of how we've lived our lives so far. And it's not that we're using these models, internal models, to make precise evaluation of percentages, saying I have a 40% chance of scoring a goal or a 92% chance of surviving if I cross the street. But we get a rough idea about what the internal model will give us of our risk. Is it going to be high, or is it going to be low if I make a particular decision in some case? And for example, when we're making the decision, we are using the size of that risk to determine whether we will make one decision or another decision. And that also depends on what will the punishment be to me if I make the wrong decision. If I decide to cross the street and I'm being hit by a bus, that's quite critical. So the penalty or the punishment for me if I make the wrong decision is going to be high. And if I'm uncertain about the risk, I don't want to have a very high risk of dying when I cross the street. I would rather wait a bit and then see if there's a better opportunity in 30 seconds or 40 seconds instead of risking my life with that. But if I'm playing football, I mean, if the risk of scoring is medium, 30%, 40%, something, I might take the chance, because if I don't hit the goal, it's not the end of the world, and I might actually score a goal, and that would be quite good. So we have an internal model. That is our experience as human beings that we use to live our lives. So what do we do when that internal model goes wrong? And how do we react if our own internal model actually turns out to give us quite bad estimates of the risks and the decisions that we want to make? Let me give you a few examples. About a year ago, last year in March, I was in Portugal for a conference together with two colleagues, both epidemiologists. And we had a discussion about this new virus that we had heard about in the news, COVID-19, and we were discussing over dinner whether or not we thought it would be a potential problem for Denmark with the COVID-19. It was mostly spread in China at that time, and also a bit in northern Italy. But we had a discussion over dinner, some very nice wine, and we came to the conclusion that the risk of it being a real problem in Denmark was quite low. Nothing would really happen. We arrived back from Portugal on March 10th, 2020, and the day after, on March 11th, Denmark closed down completely. And our prediction about what the risk was wrong. Not just a little bit wrong, but it was completely wrong at that time. So we thought the risk was low, and something completely different happened in the end. So what happened? So we had this discussion, and we used our internal models about how we thought the world was working. And we knew previous viruses. We knew MERS and SARS and the general flu, but it was certainly outside our areas of expertise. None of us were virologists. I mean, I'm a statistician, and they were epidemiologists. And we had an idea about what was going on in the other countries, but not really anything besides what we heard in the news. And that prior knowledge of how the previous similar diseases that we've seen in Denmark, they behaved, we used that to form an evaluation of how this new one, even though we actually didn't know anything about COVID-19 and what that was. So our internal model tricked us, or rather, we tricked ourselves, because we knew that we didn't know anything about COVID-19. We knew that we didn't have the information about the other countries, but still we used our own internal models, knowing that we didn't know anything about COVID-19, to make a prediction or an estimate of the risk of what would happen in Denmark. And that turned out to be wrong, and we completely forgot everything that we already knew, that this risk estimate had to be uncertain, because it was based on a lot of assumptions that we couldn't check and were based on experience and information outside the specific case that we were considering, COVID-19. So we made an estimate, the risk was going to be low, and then we completely forgot that that estimate was very, very imprecise. So what should we do about that? How should we react in situations where we are making estimates that we're going to be using for decisions, and we are forgetting, or if we don't think about it, we are forgetting that we are actually dealing with estimates, and some estimates might be very precise, and other estimates might be very, very uncertain. And we should make sure that we don't forget this uncertainty. We should make sure that whenever we are looking at evaluations of risks, either consciously or unconsciously, we are trying to also remember, how certain am I really about this number, this decision that I'm going to make? So, COVID-19, we've all experienced that, but last year around March, when that broke, things went crazy for statisticians. So let me show you a few examples of what was actually going on. So around that time, there was a desperate need from politicians, from journalists, from the public, and from media, from everyone, that they wanted information and statistical evaluation, what was going to happen. And they wanted to know, what was the risk for me as a person? Am I going to die? Are my loved ones going to die or be hurt by this new virus? What's going to happen with society? And we didn't really know anything. So there was a desperate, desperate need for predictions. What is going to happen? And one of the very early forecasts about what could potentially happen was given in the media by the Danish Minister of Health, Magnus Heunicke. And I'm sure that most of you remember this graph here, showing two possible scenarios of what would happen with the number of infected individuals over time as the virus progressed. So the orange curve here showed what would we predict would happen with the number of infected if we did nothing. And the green curve showed what would happen if we made some of the restrictions that the government initiated on March 11 with the lockdown and everything else. And the point of this graph here was to show that if we don't do anything, the orange curve, then the number of infected is going to increase quite dramatically and quite quickly. And we will have a large number of potentially infected individuals at the same time. And that will put a huge burden on the Danish health system, and especially with the number of people who might be in need of intensive care. We might not have the number of intensive care units that could accommodate those individuals, those patients. So if we could spread out the disease, that's the second scenario, the green one, we would be able to not see fewer individuals over time that were being affected. That was going to be the same, but they would arrive, the number of patients would arrive at a slower pace, and we would be able to accommodate the need for intensive care patients. So that was one of the very early predictions that we were being given, that these are two possible scenarios, and the government decided, well, we don't want to risk going with the orange one, we need to do something else, the lockdown and everything else, in order to go with the green prediction, because that will allow us to handle potential situations in the society. So those two predictions were not meant to be precise. I mean, we can't read numbers and anything out of that. It was more to show the form of the forecast, what is going to happen in one scenario and in the other scenario. But those predictions weren't just a graphical tool that the government used for arguing why we should make all those restrictions that we were seeing last year. They were actually based on a mathematical model called the SIR model. And the SIR model is the model that was used in the beginning to make a prediction about what would the number of infected individuals be. And the SIR model has been used in other situations, in other epidemics, in order to try to model the outspread of disease in certain cases. And that was the best information that we had. I mean, we've been able to use a version of this model earlier. Let's try to use the same model again with the information that we have available at this time here. So we would like to make a prediction and make a decision based on that prediction. So the SIR model puts everyone in the population in Denmark into three categories, the S and the I and the R category. So the S category is the proportion or the number of individuals that are susceptible, that can get the disease. The I category is the number of individuals or the proportion of individuals that are currently infected. And the R category is the number of people who previously have had the disease and are now recovered. And as you can see here on the graph, we start out with almost all of the population being susceptible in the top left corner, and then we have the disease is spreading, and that is being shown by the yellow curve that we see here, and we get more and more infected individuals, and at one point we can't have any more infected individuals because they start to recover, and then the yellow curve starts to level off and go down towards zero again. And in the end, the majority of the people will be recovered because they've had the disease or the virus at one point, and now they are back to being healthy. So this was before vaccines or anything else like that. So this is a very standard fundamental model in epidemiology and disease epidemiology, and that was the one that was being used in the beginning. And the two curves that Magnus Heunicke showed on the previous slide are actually two versions of the yellow curve that we see here. So the yellow curve under some conditions and the yellow curve under some other conditions, with lockdown and without lockdown. So we actually knew as statisticians and modelers one potential way of trying to make a prediction about what was going to happen. That was the SIR model that we see here. So we used that in the beginning, and people were dying, not literally, but they were dying to get information about what is going to happen. So they wanted prediction. And the State Serum Institute, SSI, made predictions initially based on a version of this model here. And just about everyone with an Excel sheet also tried to see if they could make a prediction, and the number of people on social media and also in the more old-fashioned media trying to make predictions about what was going to happen were more or less all based on a version of the SIR model and the very, very extremely sparse data that was available at that time. So the initial predictions based on the yellow curve that we see here for the SIR model say, okay, we expect that in 2 weeks the number of infected will be so many, in 3 weeks the number of infected will be so many, and so forth. And that was the reports that the State Serum Institute, SSI, provided. So they provided predictions like that in the beginning based on this version of the model. And they were wrong. And they were wrong in the sense that when people looked at the prediction, how many individuals did SSI predict would be infected in 2 weeks, and then we went along 2 weeks, and they looked at the actual number of infected individuals, and it was a lot lower. The actual number was a lot lower than the predicted. So there was a huge, huge frustration in society. I mean, they had the prediction, but it turned out to be wrong because it was much higher than what we actually saw in real life. So why are we having all these lockdowns? Why is the government using a model like this to make decisions about how we should live our lives if it's doing the wrong job? I mean, why are we even paying people to make predictions based on this if they can't even hit the right number? Those were some of the questions and some of the critique that the modelers were facing at that time. They actually didn't use a wrong model or used the model wrongly. The problem was twofold. First of all, there was so many assumptions that were changing all the time. So they made a prediction that should be used 2 weeks ahead, 3 weeks ahead, 4 weeks ahead. But the Danes changed their behavior. Well, we increased social distancing, and we didn't really know what the impact of that was. We made other restrictions on trying to reduce the contact number. We started wearing face masks. We were working from home more and more. And all of those assumptions were modified as we went along. So we were paving the road as we were driving in some sense. So we made a prediction, changed some things, and then obviously the prediction wasn't working because that was based on different assumptions from 2 weeks ago, from 3 weeks ago, from 4 weeks ago. So the assumptions about the predictions, they changed, and that was one of the major reasons why they didn't match up. So it was a bit of an unfair comparison, saying, oh, well, you made this prediction and now it's completely different, but it was also different because the world had changed. The number of restrictions and the types of restrictions had changed at that time. And that frustration kept persisting for quite a number of time, where the Serum Institute, SSI, provided these predictions, and they were constantly too high because they were erring on the safe side in some sense, and we made more restrictions that would enable us not to have a higher risk than what we really had predicted. So they were facing a lot of critique, the modelers at that point, quite unfairly, I think. So one of the problems, I think, with providing a crisp prediction like the yellow curve that you see here, is that as soon as you look at it, you think, this is what is going to happen. I have this curve, I can look at it, and in 10 weeks, there will be this number, in 15 weeks, there will be this number, and so forth. But in reality, we know it's not going to be like that. This is one prediction. And what the SSI should have done, and ended up doing a bit late in the whole process, was also to provide information about the uncertainty of their estimates. Because the thing is, even though the model might be slightly crude, it still does a fairly good job of predicting what is going on, but it's quite sensitive to our assumptions. So even though this might be our best prediction about what would happen in the future with the yellow curve, we also need to know how certain are we about that this is actually the forecast that we're going to see. So what they should have done, and ended up doing a bit late in the process, in my opinion, was not just to provide a single prediction about what's our best prediction, but also if we change or tweak the parameters slightly in the model, how is that going to influence the yellow curve? And if we do that, modify or change the parameters in that model just a little tiny bit, these are the results that we see. And as soon as we see an image like that, every one of us can see that we might have a best prediction, but it's going to be quite uncertain what is really going to happen. Because very, very small changes can play a huge impact on the size of the number of people who are infected, and also on the spread and where the peak or the top of this curve will be. So the whole model is sensitive, and we know that it's sensitive, and we need the information that it is sensitive if we want to make sure that we are making the right decisions. And if we are being presented with just a single prediction about what is going on, we're going to look at that single, very, very crisp prediction and say, okay, this is the future. But if we're being presented with information like this, we know that the future is uncertain, and that means that we can act on it, and not just believe that we have one prediction that everyone would work with, but that it can be quite uncertain what is going to happen in the future. Now, there's no pleasing everyone, because as soon as the SSI started to provide information about the uncertainty of their predictions, they were quite wide. As you can see, a lot of stuff can happen if we change the model just a little bit. So it was quite sensitive, and as soon as they provided the information about the uncertainty, people say, okay, if you can't even say anything precise, why are you doing this? I mean, we want to have something that we can work with, something that we know what is going on. But the fact is, we don't know what was going on. We didn't have the information at the time. We didn't know what the contact numbers were. We didn't know the R0 number that was used as part of this model. We didn't know anything in the beginning because COVID-19 was new. And we need to make an informed choice based also on the uncertainty that the model is providing. And a statistical evaluation and a statistical model is not wrong because it's uncertain. It's wrong if we believe that it's a lot more certain than it really is. And by providing information about the uncertainty, we can have a more informed discussion about what decisions should we make, what are the risks if we are guessing wrongly here, in this case here. Will the disease be spread further out? Will the number of intensive care patients unit needed be higher? We need to know the uncertainty to make and have a discussion about what should be going on. We need to embrace the uncertainty of our estimates. Now, there was another thing that was touted quite a bit last year with COVID-19, and that was, should we be wearing face masks or not? One of the very earliest scientific papers on that was actually a Danish paper, and it was a study called the Denmark study. Now, that study was based on around 5,000 individuals that were randomized to two groups, so 2,500 individuals in one group, 2,500 individuals in the other group. And one group was given face masks, so that was before it was mandatory to wear face masks. So one group of 2,500 individuals were given face masks and asked to wear them with the regulations that we later came to learn. And the other group was just being asked to go about live their lives as they normally would. And after a month, they tried to evaluate what was the infection rate in those two groups, how big a percentage of the group in the face mask group had COVID-19, and how big a percentage in the non-face mask group had COVID-19. And these are the main results. So in the face mask group, 1.8% had COVID-19 after a month, and in the non-face mask group, it was 2.1%. And those two percentages were used by both sides of the spectrum to argue that we should be wearing face masks and that we shouldn't be wearing face masks. So the argument that we see here towards the bottom was actually, that's a quote from the manuscript. So the difference is 0.3 percentage points. So that is just if we take 1.8 minus 2.1, that's 0.3. So that's the difference between those two numbers. But the authors of the paper actually provided information about the uncertainty. Well, we might have an estimate of 0.3, but it could be anywhere from minus 1.2 and up to plus 0.4. So even though the minus 0.3 is our best estimate of what the difference is in risk, it could be anywhere from 1.2% in one direction to 0.4% in the other direction. So people who were in favor of face masks, they looked at this result here and said, look at the number, the face mask group is 1.8%. 1.8% is less than 2.1%. And we're not going to argue with that. That's clearly true. So we should be using face masks. The proponents of not wearing face masks said, well, if you look at the difference here, it could be anything from minus 1.2% to plus 0.4%. And certainly it could also be 0% difference, because 0 is within that range. So if there's no difference between the two groups, that means that there's no benefit or no difference between the infection rate in the face mask group compared to the non-face mask group. So if it could be 0, well, we shouldn't be using face masks. at all, because the study says there's no real benefit of it. So one study, one result, two completely different conclusions. And the thing is, with this study, the only thing we can say is we don't know. We don't know yet. So minus 0.3% might be our best estimate, but because of the width of the uncertainty interval from 1.2 to 0.4, we simply don't know at this point whether or not it's beneficial to be wearing face masks and not to be wearing face masks. And that is okay. It's okay to have looked at some data and decided we still don't know. We're not sure yet. I might have a good prediction, the 0.3, but also it's not good enough for me to make a final decision whether or not I believe about face masks should be used or masks shouldn't be used at this point. So that is actually perfectly valid. So in this case here, we had the information about the prediction, we had the uncertainty of that prediction as well, and anyway, people didn't want to use or embrace the information contained in the uncertainty estimate. They wanted to make one decision. Should we be using face masks or shouldn't we be using face masks? They wouldn't allow themselves to go along and say, okay, at this point, we actually don't know. They didn't embrace the uncertainty. They wanted to make a decision either in one direction or in the other direction. So how should we go about live our lives? Well, the only thing that is certain in life, besides taxes, is that we are going away at one point. So we will all die. And obviously that's not that interesting to make an estimate about that. We would maybe rather know when. But the point is that we should, whenever we are making decisions or risk evaluations, either from our own internal model or from someone giving us a prediction, either from a government or from the media somewhere, we should demand to see information about the uncertainty. It's okay to have a prediction or a forecast, but we also want to know how certain are you about that specific prediction. So point number one is, if we go about and want to live our lives, we should not just have the risk estimates, but also the corresponding uncertainty. And the second point is that when we have that uncertainty, we should also factor that into our decisions. When we want to make the decisions, we shouldn't just have that precision and say, okay, now I have it, I'm not going to be using it anyway. We should use that information about the precision. How certain are we about what we are using for making our evaluations? And if we are uncertain, then that should certainly play a huge role in the decisions that we are making. So we should demand to know how uncertain we are, and then we should remember also to know how we want to incorporate that information into our model. And that depends on each one of us, how we want to include that uncertainty and how risk averse we are. But that we can only make that evaluation when we have information about the uncertainty. So the way to go about and live our lives is to have good risk estimates from our internal models or from someone else, and also be aware of how good could those risk evaluations really be. That will enable us to live our lives to the best of our opportunity today, but also make sure that we are embracing the uncertainty so we can live our lives tomorrow to the best of our opportunity. So when we go out of the door today, remember to embrace the uncertainty of our estimates. Thank you.